December 19, 1944. The Vosges Mountains of northeastern France, temperature hovering just above freezing, fog rolling through pine forests so thick that visibility dropped to less than 50 meters. Staff Sergeant James Henderson of the 761st Tank Battalion crouched beside his M4 Sherman, watching the tree line with eyes that had learned to see what others missed. His crew had been told they would see limited action, that their role would be primarily support and transport. They had been told, repeatedly and explicitly, that their presence on the front lines made certain commanding officers uncomfortable. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What Henderson and thousands of soldiers like him were about to prove would challenge every assumption about courage, capability, and what it meant to serve a nation that had not fully decided they deserved to serve it. The 761st Tank Battalion was not supposed to exist in the way it did. Activated at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, in April 1942, it was one of only 2 independent tank battalions composed entirely of black enlisted men and non-commissioned officers, commanded initially by white officers who had varying degrees of confidence in their men's abilities. The military establishment of 1942 operated under a deeply flawed assumption, one backed by pseudoscientific studies and cultural prejudice, that black soldiers lacked the technical aptitude and mental discipline required for armored warfare. The Sherman tank, with its mechanical complexity, tactical coordination requirements, and split-second decision-making demands, was considered beyond their capabilities. Second Lieutenant David Williams had heard all the theories during his officer training. He remembered one instructor, a veteran of the previous global conflict, explaining with absolute certainty that armored warfare required a level of mechanical intuition and spatial reasoning that could not be taught to everyone. The implication had been clear, even when the words remained carefully neutral. Williams, one of the few black officers who would eventually lead men in the 761st, had smiled politely and taken notes, knowing that within months he would be proving that instructor catastrophically wrong. Training at Camp Claiborne had been intense and exhaustive. The battalion received M5 Stuart light tanks initially, vehicles that were already being phased out of frontline service in favor of heavier armor. The symbolism was not lost on anyone. While white tank battalions trained on the newest equipment, the 761st made do with older machines. But what those assigning equipment failed to understand was that mechanical challenges breed mechanical expertise. Corporal Robert Madison, a former auto mechanic from Detroit, could disassemble and reassemble an M5's engine in conditions that would have sent manual-trained mechanics searching for their technical orders. The men who filled the ranks of the 761st came from every corner of America, bringing with them diverse backgrounds and experiences that would prove invaluable. Private First Class Thomas Wright had grown up on a farm in Mississippi, where mechanical improvisation was a matter of necessity rather than choice. When farm equipment broke down during harvest season, you either fixed it with what you had or lost your crop. That mindset, that ability to solve problems with limited resources, translated directly to maintaining tanks in field conditions where proper parts and tools were luxuries rather than guarantees. Private Marcus Johnson arrived from Chicago, where he had worked in a manufacturing plant that produced precision machinery. His understanding of mechanical tolerances and assembly procedures gave him insights into how tanks functioned at a level that went beyond operator knowledge. When something went wrong, Johnson could often diagnose the problem by sound alone, hearing variations in engine noise or transmission operation that indicated developing failures before they became critical. Private Leonard Hayes came from rural North Carolina, where his family had operated a small trucking business. He understood logistics and supply in practical terms, knew how to maximize the efficiency of limited resources, and brought a perspective that proved valuable when the battalion had to operate with supply lines that were stretched thin. Hayes could calculate fuel consumption rates and ammunition expenditure in ways that ensured his crew never ran out at critical moments. The battalion's training performance metrics told a story that made certain officers uncomfortable. Gunnery scores consistently exceeded expectations. Mechanical readiness rates surpassed those of comparable units. Tactical exercises revealed crews that communicated with precision and moved with coordinated efficiency, yet recommendations for deployment to frontline combat roles were repeatedly delayed. The official explanations cited readiness concerns and equipment availability. The unofficial reasons were spoken in quieter conversations, in officers' clubs where whiskey loosened tongues and revealed the prejudices that policy attempted to conceal. By late 1943, the battalion had been re-equipped with M4 Sherman medium tanks, the workhorse of American armored forces. Each Sherman weighed approximately 33 tons, carried a crew of 5, and mounted a 75mm main gun capable of engaging both armor and fortified positions. The tank's mechanical complexity was significant, with a Continental R975 radial engine producing 400 horsepower, a transmission requiring careful synchronization, and hydraulic systems that demanded constant maintenance. Every crew member needed to understand not just their primary role, but every other position, because combat had a way of creating vacancies without warning. Tank Commander Sergeant First Class Samuel Rivers had trained his crew to standards that exceeded manual specifications. His gunner, Corporal Eddie Jackson, could identify vehicle silhouettes at ranges approaching 2,000 meters and estimate distance with an accuracy that rivaled mechanical rangefinders. His driver, Private First Class Thomas Wright, had developed an almost supernatural feel for terrain, knowing instinctively where a 33-ton tank could go and where it would bog down. His assistant driver and bow gunner, Private Marcus Johnson, had memorized every sightline and firing angle from his position. His loader, Private Leonard Hayes, could cycle 75mm rounds with a rhythm that kept their rate of fire consistently higher than manual standards suggested was possible. What made Rivers' crew exceptional was not any single skill but their integration as a team. Inside a Sherman, you could not see much of the outside world through the periscopes and vision blocks. You operated in a space barely large enough for 5 men and all their equipment, where temperatures could swing from below freezing to above 43 degrees Celsius, depending on whether the engine was running and whether something outside was trying to set you on fire. You breathed air thick with cordite smoke, engine fumes, and the metallic smell of hot brass. You communicated over an intercom system that turned everyone's voice into a tinny approximation while the engine roared and the gun fired and the whole vehicle shook with impacts. Creating effective teamwork in those conditions required trust that went beyond professional respect. Rivers had learned leadership in circumstances that most officer training courses never addressed. He had grown up in Alabama, where speaking up could bring consequences that went far beyond professional setback. He had learned to read people, to understand when direct confrontation was necessary, and when patient persistence achieved better results. He applied those lessons to managing his crew, knowing each man's strengths and limitations, understanding how to motivate without demoralizing, how to correct without crushing confidence. Jackson, his gunner, was 22 years old and had never fired a weapon before joining the military. His civilian background was in photography, where he had developed an exceptional eye for detail and distance estimation. That visual acuity translated to gunnery in ways that formal training could enhance but never create. Rivers recognized this natural ability and built training programs specifically to develop it. Jackson spent hours studying vehicle identification cards, learning to distinguish friendly from hostile vehicles at maximum range. He practiced range estimation until he could judge distance within 50 meters, at ranges exceeding a kilometer. Wright, the driver, brought farming experience that proved more valuable than any amount of classroom instruction. He understood terrain the way a farmer understands soil, knowing by observation and feel what ground would support weight and what would collapse under it. He could read the landscape and anticipate where the tank would find traction and where it would bog down. This knowledge saved the crew multiple times, allowing them to maneuver through terrain that should have been impassable, finding routes that maps said did not exist. Johnson, in his position as assistant driver and bow gunner, faced unique challenges. His visibility was even more limited than the commander's, restricted to a narrow periscope view and his gun sight. He had to maintain situational awareness primarily through the intercom and by interpreting the tank's movements. Johnson developed a mental map ability, tracking their position and orientation even when he could not see outside. This spatial awareness meant he could provide accurate fire even when the tank was moving through terrain that blocked most visibility. Hayes, the loader, had perhaps the most physically demanding position. 75mm rounds weighed approximately 21 pounds each. A sustained engagement might require loading 30 or 40 rounds in a matter of minutes. Hayes had to select the correct ammunition type based on the target, extract it from storage racks in a confined space, load it into the breech, and be ready for the next round the instant Jackson fired. He developed techniques that minimized wasted motion, creating a rhythm that turned loading from a series of discrete actions into one continuous flow. The battalion shipped to England in September 1944, crossing the Atlantic in convoy, while the conflict in Europe reached what many thought might be its final months. The German armed forces of that era had been pushed back from France following the operations that began in June. The assumption among many planners was that the conflict would conclude before winter. The 761st would provide support services, perhaps conduct occupation duties, but genuine combat seemed unlikely. That assumption would prove incorrect in ways that no one anticipated. The crossing itself presented challenges that tested the battalion even before they reached combat. Tanks were secured in ship holds, but the Atlantic in September could be rough. Crews worked constantly to ensure the securing chains and restraints held against storm-driven movements that could have broken vehicles loose. Madison and the other mechanics conducted inspections that went beyond standard procedures, knowing that any damage sustained during transport would have to be repaired with limited facilities once they reached England. England in September 1944 was a staging ground for operations that were pushing into Germany from the west. The infrastructure was stretched, supporting multiple armies, and newly arrived units often found themselves at the end of supply priorities. The 761st established their camp and began the process of preparing vehicles for combat operations. This meant more than mechanical checks. It meant modifying tanks based on lessons learned by units already in combat, adding extra track sections for additional armor protection, installing brackets for carrying extra fuel and ammunition, removing equipment that experience showed was unnecessary, and adding improvised solutions that manuals never specified. Henderson supervised these modifications for his platoon, working alongside Madison and other mechanics who understood that preparation now might determine survival later. They added spare road wheels to hull fronts, providing additional armor against smaller caliber weapons. They fabricated storage racks for extra machine gun ammunition, recognizing that sustained operations often exhausted initial loads. They waterproofed hatches and installed extra tarps, knowing that winter in Northern Europe meant rain and snow that could immobilize crews unable to maintain dry fighting positions. November 1944 found the battalion in France, attached to the 12th Armored Division initially, before being reassigned based on tactical needs. The military's use of independent tank battalions allowed for flexible deployment, attaching armor to infantry divisions that lacked organic tank support. This flexibility meant the 761st would see action across multiple sectors, supporting different units and facing varied tactical situations. It also meant they operated without the institutional support and supply priority that battalions permanently assigned to armored divisions enjoyed. The first significant engagement came in the Vosges Mountains, where American forces were pushing through terrain that favored defenders. The Vosges presented challenges that nullified many advantages of armored warfare. Roads were few and easily blocked, forests, limited visibility and maneuverability. The cold and wet weather turned unpaved routes into mud that could immobilize vehicles. German forces of that period had established defensive positions that maximized these natural obstacles, creating killing zones where American armor would be channeled into prepared fields of fire. Henderson's tank, nicknamed Taffy after his daughter back in Georgia, led a column supporting an infantry advance toward a village that intelligence suggested was lightly held. The designation was optimistic. As the column rounded a bend where the road cut through dense pine forest, Henderson saw the telltale flash that meant someone ahead had fired. The sound reached him a fraction of a second later and the road 50 meters in front erupted as an anti-tank round impacted exactly where the column would have been if Henderson had not already been braking hard. The intercom crackled with his gunner's voice, calm despite the situation. Jackson had spotted the firing position, an anti-tank gun concealed in the tree line, approximately 800 meters distant. Henderson confirmed the target, and the turret began traversing with the electric motor's distinctive whine. The German gun crew would be reloading, calculating whether to engage again or displace before return fire arrived. Henderson made the decision easy for them. Jackson fired, and the 75mm gun's recoil rocked the tank, even as the muzzle blast kicked up dust and debris. Through his periscope, Henderson saw the tracer arc toward the target, saw the impact, saw secondary explosions that suggested they had hit stored ammunition. The German gun would not be firing again, but one gun did not constitute light resistance, and Henderson knew what came next. The radio carried urgent calls from the infantry they were supporting. Small arms fire from multiple positions, at least 2 machine guns, possibly more anti-tank weapons. The infantry was pinned down approximately 300 meters ahead, unable to advance or withdraw without exposing themselves to fire. Standard procedure called for infantry and armor to work in combination, with tanks suppressing positions while infantry maneuvered. But the terrain made that coordination difficult, and the Germans of that era had become experts at creating situations where standard procedures led to standard casualties. Henderson made a decision that the manual would not have recommended. He ordered his tank forward, alone, to draw fire and identify positions, while the rest of the column maneuvered for better firing angles. His driver, Wright, acknowledged the order without hesitation, advancing the Sherman down the road at a speed that balanced urgency against the need to maintain control on the narrow track. The tank's engine roared, and Henderson felt the familiar sensation of being simultaneously exposed and blind, knowing that every second brought them closer to positions they could not yet see. The German defenders opened fire with everything they had. Machine gun rounds sparked off the Sherman's armor, with sounds like industrial machinery gone mad. An anti-tank round passed so close overhead that Henderson felt the pressure wave through the open hatch. Wright kept the tank moving, weaving as much as the road allowed, making them a harder target, while Henderson called out positions to Jackson. The gunner engaged each position methodically, high-explosive rounds suppressing machine guns, while the bow gunner, Johnson, fired the hull-mounted machine gun at anything that moved. Inside the tank, the noise was overwhelming. The engine at full power created a roar that made spoken communication impossible, everything going through the intercom that turned voices into compressed approximations. The main gun firing added concussive shock that you felt in your chest, not just heard. Shell casings ejected with metallic clangs, and the smell of burnt propellant mixed with engine exhaust created an atmosphere that was barely breathable. Wright focused on his narrow view ahead, steering by instinct as much as sight, while Johnson traversed his machine gun and fired at targets Henderson identified. Hayes worked in near darkness at the back of the turret, extracting rounds from racks by touch and memory, loading them into the breech with practiced movements that required no thought. He could feel the tank's motion, knew when Wright was turning hard and braced accordingly, anticipated the recoil, and prepared for the next round even before Jackson confirmed he was ready to fire again. This was the reality of armored combat that training could simulate but never fully replicate. The combination of violence and mechanical precision that required crews to function as single organisms rather than collections of individuals. The engagement lasted perhaps 7 minutes, though Henderson's perception of time had compressed the way it always did in combat. When the German fire slackened, the infantry was able to advance and clear the positions. The village fell with fewer casualties than anticipated, primarily because Henderson's tank had drawn fire that would otherwise have targeted men with no armor at all. The infantry commander, a captain who had initially been skeptical about having a black tank battalion in support, found Henderson after the action and shook his hand with genuine respect. It was a small moment, but significant for what it represented. That evening, as crews performed maintenance and prepared for the next day's operations, Henderson gathered his men for an after-action review. This was standard procedure, but Henderson approached it with intensity that went beyond checking boxes on forms. He wanted to understand what had worked and what needed improvement. wanted to ensure that every engagement made them more effective for the next one. Jackson described his target acquisition process, explaining how he had identified the anti-tank gun by the way vegetation had been disturbed around its position. Wright talked about the road surface and how he had felt the tank beginning to slip at one point, forcing him to adjust his line. Johnson discussed how he had prioritized targets for his machine gun, engaging muzzle flashes that indicated active firing positions rather than wasting ammunition on areas that might contain defenders. Hayes mentioned that one ammunition rack had proven difficult to access during the engagement, requiring him to contort in ways that slowed his loading cycle. Madison, listening to this discussion, made notes about modifications that could improve rack positioning. This was the kind of continuous improvement that characterized the battalion, the willingness to learn from every experience and adjust procedures accordingly. Similar engagements followed throughout the Vosges campaign. The 761st supported multiple divisions, earning recognition for effectiveness that contradicted every negative assumption. They fought in conditions that challenged the best equipment and most experienced crews, maintaining operational readiness rates that impressed maintenance officers and confounded those who had predicted failure. Each successful action built their reputation, but also increased the demands placed upon them. The weather worsened as November progressed into December. Rain turned roads into mud that could trap vehicles. Fog limited visibility to distances measured in meters rather than kilometers. Temperatures dropped low enough that water froze in canteens, and mechanical systems required constant attention to prevent cold from degrading performance. Crews learned to sleep in their tanks when possible, using engine heat for warmth even though it meant breathing exhaust-contaminated air. The alternative was exposure to cold that could incapacitate as effectively as enemy fire. Williams, now commanding a platoon, dealt with challenges that extended beyond tactical employment of his tanks. Supply shortages meant ammunition rationing, forcing gunners to be selective about when to engage. Fuel constraints required careful route planning to ensure tanks could reach objectives without running dry. Food was often cold rations eaten while moving, because stopping to prepare hot meals created vulnerabilities that could be exploited. These mundane logistics challenges could determine whether operations succeeded or failed, making Williams' experience as much about resource management as about tactical decision-making. December 1944 brought the conflict in the Ardennes, the massive German offensive that history would remember as one of the conflict's most desperate gambles. The German armed forces of that era concentrated armor and infantry for a drive through the Ardennes forest, achieving surprise and initial success that threatened to split American forces and reach critical supply bases. The offensive required every available unit to respond, including independent tank battalions that might otherwise have been held in reserve. The 761st was ordered north to help contain the penetration. They moved through winter conditions that turned roads into ice and reduced visibility to distances measured in meters rather than kilometers. Tanks that were maintained meticulously still broke down because mechanical systems were not designed for sustained operation in temperatures that dropped below -15 degrees Celsius. Crews worked through the night to keep engines from freezing, to clear ice from vision blocks, to maintain weapons that cold made brittle and unreliable. The movement north was an operation in itself. Tanks could travel on roads, but extended road marches wore out track and suspension components that were already stressed from combat operations. The battalion moved in stages, with maintenance halts every few hours, to check for developing problems and address them before they became failures. Madison and his fellow mechanics performed miracles, replacing track blocks by flashlight in sub-zero temperatures, adjusting tensioners and road wheels that cold had contracted beyond normal specifications, improvising repairs that manuals said required depot facilities. Henderson's crew dealt with a transmission issue during one of these movements, a problem that should have required the tank to be left behind for proper repair. Madison crawled underneath the vehicle in conditions that made working dangerous, diagnosed a linkage problem, and fabricated a temporary fix using wire and a piece of scrap metal. The repair lasted long enough to get them to their destination, where proper parts could be installed. This kind of ingenuity kept the battalion operational, when by all rights they should have had tanks deadlined waiting for supply. Lieutenant Williams, now commanding a platoon, led his tanks into positions defending a critical road junction. The tactical situation was unclear, with reports of German forces in areas that should have been secured and friendly units displaced from their expected positions. The fog of uncertainty that always accompanied combat had thickened into genuine confusion about who controlled what terrain. Williams established his platoon in defensive positions and waited, knowing that in conditions like these, the side that maintained discipline and did not panic held significant advantage. The positions Williams selected demonstrated tactical judgment that reflected his growing experience. He placed tanks where they had overlapping fields of fire but could not all be engaged simultaneously. He ensured each crew had multiple routes for withdrawal if positions became untenable. He coordinated with infantry, who were occupying positions between the tanks, establishing communication procedures and recognition signals that would prevent friendly fire incidents in the confusion of combat. The German attack came in early morning darkness, preceded by artillery fire that was less about causing casualties than about creating noise and confusion. Williams heard the engines before he saw anything, the distinctive sound of tracked vehicles, moving with the confidence of forces that believed they had achieved surprise. His crews held fire, waiting for targets to emerge from the darkness and morning fog at ranges where even the Sherman's gun could guarantee hits. The discipline required to hold fire while enemy vehicles approached was immense. Every instinct said to shoot, to engage at maximum range and hope for hits. But Williams knew that revealing positions prematurely would sacrifice the advantage of surprise and allow enemy forces to maneuver against known locations. His crews trusted his judgment, fingers on triggers but waiting for the order that would release them to fight. When Williams gave the order to fire, 4 Shermans engaged simultaneously, catching a column of German vehicles in a kill zone with no cover and limited room to maneuver. The engagement was brief and decisive. German forces withdrew, leaving behind disabled vehicles and abandoning their attempt to seize the junction. Williams' platoon had held a position that, if lost, would have opened routes deeper into American-held territory. The broader tactical significance might not have been immediately apparent to the men in the tanks, but division staff recognized that competent defensive action at key points was preventing small penetrations from becoming large ones. The aftermath of this engagement revealed the human cost that statistics could not capture. One of Williams's tanks had been hit, the round penetrating the hull and wounding 2 crew members. Neither injury was life-threatening, but both men needed evacuation to medical facilities. Williams had to reorganize his platoon, redistributing crew members to keep tanks operational while ensuring wounded men received proper care. This balance between mission requirements and human welfare defined much of small unit leadership, forcing decisions that had no perfect answers. Throughout the Ardennes operations, which would last into January 1945, the 761st performed with consistency that made them a requested asset. Division commanders who initially accepted their attachment with private reservations learned to specifically request them for difficult missions. The pattern repeated across different sectors and different tactical situations. When infantry needed support in terrain where coordination was difficult, the 761st's crews showed they could work effectively with soldiers they had just met. When defensive positions needed holding against determined attacks, their crews demonstrated the discipline to wait for good shots rather than wasting ammunition on low-probability targets. When offensive operations required tanks to lead advances through uncertain terrain, their crews showed they could balance aggression with caution. Corporal Madison, the former Detroit mechanic, became legendary among maintenance personnel for his ability to repair damage that should have required depot-level facilities. He fabricated parts from scavenged materials, improvised solutions to problems that manuals said were impossible to fix in field conditions, and kept tanks operational through mechanical ingenuity that made him invaluable. His skills meant that the battalion's operational readiness rate stayed high, even when supply lines were stretched and replacement parts were delayed. One particular repair became the subject of stories that spread beyond the battalion. A tank had suffered damage to its final drive. the gear assembly that transmitted power from the transmission to the drive sprockets. The proper repair required removing the entire assembly and replacing it with a new one, work that could take trained mechanics several days in a properly equipped shop. The tank was immobilized in a forward position, blocking a route that needed to remain clear. Madison assessed the damage and determined that while the final drive was beyond field repair, he could modify the tank to operate on single-side drive, using only one track to maneuver. He removed the damaged assembly entirely, bypassed the connection, and had the tank operational within 6 hours. It could not fight effectively, but it could move itself back to positions where proper repairs could be conducted. The human cost of these operations was significant. The 761st suffered casualties proportionate to their combat involvement, with crews killed or wounded in the same ways that affected all tank units. Shermans caught fire when penetrated, a characteristic that crews dealt with by drilling evacuation procedures until they could abandon a hit tank in seconds. Crew members were wounded by fragments that entered through vision blocks or by concussion, when rounds struck armor without penetrating. Some were lost to accidents that had nothing to do with enemy action, because operating 33-ton vehicles in winter conditions created hazards that were equally dangerous. Each loss affected the men who continued to serve. Rivers lost his loader, Hayes, when an anti-tank round penetrated their Sherman during an engagement in January 1945. The replacement, a young soldier fresh from training, had to learn in days what Hayes had perfected over months. Rivers drove his crew harder after that, knowing that their survival depended on everyone performing at levels that training alone could not guarantee. The new loader adapted, because the alternative was failing his crew at a moment when failure meant casualties. The replacement loader was Private Daniel Cooper, 19 years old, from Philadelphia. He had completed basic training and advanced individual training, but had never been in combat. Rivers recognized that Cooper's technical knowledge meant little without the experiential understanding that came from repeated exposure to the controlled chaos of armored combat. He assigned Jackson to work with Cooper during maintenance periods, teaching him not just the mechanics of loading, but the rhythm and flow that made good loaders exceptional. Cooper's first engagement was terrifying in ways that training could never replicate. The noise, the confined space, the smell of propellant, and the heat from the gun all combined to create sensory overload that threatened to paralyze him. But Hayes had trained him well in the fundamentals, and muscle memory took over when conscious thought became difficult. He loaded, Jackson fired, the tank rocked with recoil, the empty casing ejected, and Cooper reached for the next round. After the engagement, Rivers took him aside and told him that he had done well, that his performance had been solid, and that the crew trusted him. Cooper never forgot that conversation or the confidence it provided. By February 1945, the 761st had been in sustained combat for 3 months, supporting operations across multiple sectors and accumulating a record that spoke for itself. They had destroyed or disabled enemy armor in numbers that impressed intelligence officers. They had supported infantry advances that captured objectives ahead of schedule. They had held defensive positions against attacks that should have overwhelmed them. And they had done all of this while operating with less supply priority and less institutional support than comparable units. The recognition came in forms both official and unofficial. Battle efficiency citations acknowledged their performance in terms that made no distinction based on race. Infantry commanders wrote commendations that described specific actions where tank support had been decisive. Maintenance officers documented readiness rates that exceeded standards, but perhaps more significant were the informal acknowledgements, the moments when white soldiers who had grown up with certain assumptions found themselves forced to recognize that courage and competence had no racial component. Henderson received a field promotion to platoon sergeant, a position of responsibility that reflected his demonstrated leadership. The promotion came with additional duties, but also additional authority, allowing him to influence training and tactical employment in ways that benefited the entire platoon. Williams advanced to first lieutenant and took command of a company when casualties created an opening. His elevation to company command was significant, as it placed a black officer in direct command of over 60 men and 15 tanks, a level of responsibility that many in the military establishment had doubted black officers could handle. Madison was recommended for officer candidate school based on his technical expertise and leadership qualities. The recommendation came from the battalion maintenance officer, a white captain who had initially been skeptical about working with a segregated unit. Madison declined the recommendation, preferring to remain with the crews he had kept running. His decision reflected a loyalty to his fellow soldiers that transcended personal advancement, a choice that earned him respect that rank alone could never have provided. Across the battalion, men who had been told they were incapable of mastering armored warfare were proving themselves not just capable, but exceptional. Gunnery scores that had been dismissed as statistical anomalies became consistent patterns. Tactical performance that had been attributed to luck revealed itself as the product of training and discipline. Mechanical proficiency that had been thought impossible became routine. Every measure by which armored units were evaluated showed the 761st performing at or above standards that applied to all tank battalions. The broader significance of what the 761st accomplished extended beyond their tactical contributions. They served at a time when the American military remained segregated, when policies and attitudes reflected a society that had not yet fully committed to equality. Their performance challenged assumptions that were deeply embedded in military culture and American society. Every successful mission, every commendation, every statistical measure of their effectiveness became evidence that the restrictions placed on black soldiers were based on prejudice rather than capability. March 1945 brought the crossing of the Rhine, the last major natural barrier before the industrial heartland of Germany. The 761st supported the assault crossings. Their tanks ferried across on improvised rafts and temporary bridges while under fire. The technical challenges of amphibious operations added another dimension to their demonstrated versatility. Henderson's tank was among the first across in their sector, supporting engineers who were working under fire to establish a secure bridgehead. The Rhine crossing represented a complex operation that required precise coordination between multiple unit types. Engineers constructed pontoon bridges while under fire, working with urgency, because delays meant exposing more men to defensive fire. Infantry established positions on the far bank to protect bridge construction. Artillery provided covering fire to suppress defensive positions. And tanks crossed as soon as bridges could support their weight, providing mobile firepower that could respond to threats faster than towed artillery. Henderson's crew crossed on a pontoon bridge that swayed and flexed under the Sherman's 33-ton weight. Wright drove with extreme care, knowing that any deviation from the narrow bridge deck could send them into water too deep for fording. The crossing felt endless, though it probably lasted less than 5 minutes. Defensive fire came from positions on the far bank, rounds impacting around the bridge and creating geysers of water that drenched the tank. Jackson could not return fire effectively while moving, but Johnson engaged with the Bow machine gun, suppressing positions even though his accuracy was limited. Once across, Henderson's tank immediately moved to engage positions threatening the bridge. The far bank was chaos, with engineers working to expand the bridgehead while infantry cleared buildings and defensive positions. Henderson coordinated with the infantry commander, identifying targets that tanks could engage more effectively than individual riflemen. His crew systematically suppressed positions, allowing infantry to advance and secure more ground. The final weeks of the conflict in Europe saw the 761st advancing through territory that was collapsing under the combined pressure of forces attacking from multiple directions. They liberated towns where residents emerged from cellars to watch American tanks roll through streets. The reception varied. Some civilians greeted them with genuine relief, others regarded them with confusion, having been told that American forces would be different. The presence of black soldiers operating complex equipment challenged German propaganda that had portrayed non-white peoples as inferior. Henderson remembered one town in particular, where an elderly woman approached his tank after the area had been secured. She stared at him for a long moment, then asked in broken English if he was American. Henderson confirmed that he was, and she shook her head in apparent disbelief. The propaganda she had been exposed to had not prepared her for the reality of competent, professional black soldiers. Her cognitive dissonance was visible, and Henderson found it oddly satisfying, a small personal victory over the ideology his country had been fighting against. They encountered displaced persons from across Europe, people who had been forced into labor or imprisoned in camps that revealed the full horror of the regime they had been fighting against. These encounters added moral weight to what they had endured, making clear that their service had been in opposition to something genuinely evil. The men of the 761st, many of whom had experienced discrimination and prejudice in their own country, found themselves liberating people who had suffered under a different but equally pernicious form of hatred. Williams would later reflect on the irony of fighting against a regime built on racial supremacy while serving in a segregated military. The contradiction was not lost on the men who served, but they also understood that progress came incrementally, that their service contributed to change even if that change was not yet complete. They fought for an America that did not yet fully recognize their humanity, but they fought because they believed in what America could become, not just what it was. When the conflict in Europe concluded in May 1945, the 761st Tank Battalion had compiled a record that ranked among the most distinguished of any independent tank battalion. They had been in combat for 183 consecutive days. They had supported 12 different infantry divisions across 6 different campaigns. They had destroyed or disabled over 50 enemy armored vehicles and countless fortified positions. They had liberated numerous towns and villages, and they had done all of this despite operating in a military that remained segregated and often doubted their capabilities. The statistics told part of the story. The battalion fired over 90,000 rounds of 75mm ammunition during their combat operations. They consumed over 600,000 gallons of fuel, moving through multiple campaigns. They traveled over 23,000 kilometers under combat conditions, through terrain ranging from mountains to forests to open plains. Their maintenance crews performed over 15,000 repair actions in field conditions, keeping tanks operational through mechanical expertise and improvisation. These numbers represented sustained operational tempo that would have challenged any unit, regardless of composition. But statistics alone could not capture the full significance of what they achieved. The 761st proved that courage was not determined by race, that technical competence was not limited by skin color, that leadership emerged from character rather than demographic categories. They served in a military that did not always value them equally, and a society that had not yet recognized their full humanity. Their response was to perform at levels that made denial of their capabilities impossible. The men who served in the 761st returned to an America that was not yet ready to fully acknowledge what they had accomplished. Segregation remained legal in much of the country. Discrimination in employment, housing, and education continued. The GI Bill that helped many veterans build middle-class lives was administered in ways that limited black veterans' access to its benefits. The recognition they received in Europe did not automatically translate to equality at home. Henderson returned to Georgia, to a daughter who had grown up with her father's letters but without his presence. He found work eventually, though not always work that valued his leadership experience or technical skills. He remained in contact with men from his crew, the bonds formed in combat proving more durable than those of most civilian relationships. When asked about his service, he spoke matter-of-factly about the operations they conducted and the challenges they overcame, deflecting praise while acknowledging the pride he felt in what they achieved. The transition to civilian life was difficult for many veterans, but particularly challenging for black veterans who returned to a society that had not changed in their absence. Henderson found that employers valued his military experience on paper, but became less enthusiastic when they met him in person. Jobs that should have been available to someone with his skills and leadership experience somehow became filled by the time he arrived for interviews. He eventually found work at a factory, operating machinery that was far simpler than the tanks he had commanded, working for supervisors who had never faced the challenges he had overcome. Williams continued in the military, serving through the desegregation that came in 1948 and retiring as a colonel in 1968. He witnessed the transformation of a segregated military into one that, while not perfect, offered opportunities based on merit rather than race. He mentored younger officers, passing on lessons learned in the Vosges and the Ardennes, teaching that competence and character mattered more than any demographic category. His career after the conflict included assignments that would have been impossible in a segregated military. He commanded integrated units, served on staffs where his race was irrelevant to his responsibilities, and watched as the military became a model for how American society could function when prejudice was removed from policy. Williams never forgot where he came from or the men he had served with, but he also appreciated the progress that their service had helped make possible. Madison returned to Detroit and opened an automotive repair shop that became successful enough to support a family and employ skilled mechanics regardless of their background. He never advertised his military service, but veterans who found their way to his shop noticed the precision with which he approached complex mechanical problems and the way he could improvise solutions that manual-trained mechanics might miss. Those who asked learned that he had kept Shermans running in conditions that should have been impossible, and they understood why his shop had a reputation for solving problems that other mechanics declared unfixable. The shop became more than just a business. It became a place where veterans could gather, where stories were shared and memories preserved. Madison employed several veterans over the years, giving them opportunities when other employers would not. He understood that technical skills mattered, but he also valued the work ethic and discipline that military service instilled. His shop became known for quality work and fair prices, building a customer base that appreciated both. Rivers remained in the military as well, rising to sergeant major and serving in subsequent conflicts, where his experience from 1944 and 45 informed his approach to training and leadership. He emphasized to young soldiers that technical proficiency mattered less than teamwork. That individual skill was insufficient without integration into an effective crew. The lessons he taught came from experience that had proved their value in circumstances where failure meant casualties. His influence extended beyond his own unit. Rivers became a sought-after instructor, teaching at schools where future tank commanders learned their craft. He brought real-world experience to training scenarios, helping students understand the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical application. He challenged them to think beyond manuals and procedures, to develop the judgment that only came from repeated exposure to complex situations. Jackson, the gunner who had proven that visual acuity could rival mechanical rangefinders, used his GI Bill benefits to attend college and eventually became a photographer. His wartime experience identifying targets at extreme ranges translated to civilian work that required exceptional attention to detail and distance estimation. He worked in architectural photography, where precise framing and depth perception were essential. He never forgot the men he had served with or the skills he had developed in a Sherman turret. Wright returned to Mississippi and eventually bought the farm where he had grown up. His understanding of terrain and mechanical systems made him a successful farmer, able to maximize yields and maintain equipment that others would have replaced. He served in his community quietly, never seeking recognition, but earning respect through competence and character. Those who knew his history understood that managing a farm was far simpler than driving a tank through combat, but Wright approached both with the same careful attention to detail. Johnson used his manufacturing background and military experience to secure work in precision machining, eventually becoming a quality control supervisor. His ability to identify problems by sound and feel, developed in the bowgunner's position, transferred directly to industrial applications where detecting variations in manufacturing processes prevented defects. He mentored younger workers, passing on lessons about attention to detail and systematic approaches to problem solving. Cooper, the replacement loader who had proven himself under fire, became a teacher after the conflict. He taught high school mathematics and physics, using lessons from his military service to illustrate practical applications of theoretical concepts. He never told his students about his combat experience unless they asked, but those who did ask learned about the importance of preparation, the value of teamwork, and the reality that success often came from executing fundamentals under pressure. The 761st Tank Battalion was deactivated in 1945, its mission complete and its personnel dispersed to other units or civilian life. The institutional memory of their service became part of the historical record, documented in after-action reports and commendation citations and the statistics that measured their effectiveness. But for many years, their story remained obscure outside military historical circles, overshadowed by accounts that focused on other units and different narratives. The fuller recognition of their contributions came gradually, as historians examined records and veterans shared their experiences. The pattern of exceptional performance under difficult conditions emerged clearly when examined objectively. The 761st had not just performed adequately, they had excelled. They had not just met standards, they had exceeded them. They had not just survived combat, they had thrived in it. Their legacy extended beyond their own service. The 761st, along with other black units that served with distinction, provided evidence that forced the military to reconsider its segregationist policies. The desegregation order of 1948 came in part because units like the 761st had made the old justifications for segregation unsustainable. You could not maintain that black soldiers lacked capability when the record showed otherwise. You could not argue they could not handle complex equipment when they had mastered some of the most complex equipment in the inventory. You could not claim they lacked courage when they had repeatedly demonstrated it under fire. The story of the 761st Tank Battalion represents both what was achieved and what was denied. They proved themselves in circumstances that should never have required proof. They earned recognition that should have been automatic. They demonstrated capabilities that should never have been doubted. The fact that their service was remarkable says something profound about the society they served and the assumptions they overcame. Henderson, before he passed away in 1986, gave an interview to a local newspaper doing a Veterans Day feature. The reporter asked what he wanted people to know about his service. His answer was characteristically modest but revealing. He said that he wanted people to know that his crew did their job, that they did it well, and that they took pride in their service. He did not emphasize the obstacles they overcame or the prejudice they faced. He focused on the work itself, on the competence and courage that he and his fellow soldiers demonstrated. That perspective, that focus on the work and the mission rather than the injustice of the circumstances, characterized many of the men who served in units like the 761st. They did not serve to make political statements, though their service had political implications. They did not fight to prove points, though their performance proved many. They served because their country was at conflict, because they believed in something larger than themselves, and because they refused to accept the limitations that others tried to impose. The Sherman tanks they crewed have long since been scrapped or placed in museums. The villages they liberated have rebuilt and grown beyond recognition. The roads they traveled are now paved highways bearing traffic that includes no tanks. The men who served have mostly passed on, taking with them first-hand knowledge of what they experienced and accomplished. But the record remains, in official documents and historical accounts, in the memories of families who knew these men, and in the legacy of a military that became more just because of what they proved. The 761st Tank Battalion demonstrated that excellence is not limited by race, that courage comes in all colors, and that capability has nothing to do with skin tone. They proved these truths not through words, but through actions, not through arguments, but through results. They served a nation that had not yet fully recognized their humanity and proved themselves in ways that made denial of their capabilities impossible. Their story is part of the larger narrative of how America evolved from a segregated society toward a more just one, a journey that continues today. The 761st contributed to that evolution not by seeking to, but simply by being excellent at what they did. They showed that when given opportunity and proper equipment, black soldiers could match or exceed any standard. They demonstrated that leadership emerged from character and experience, not from demographic categories. They proved that the assumptions justifying segregation were wrong, not through rhetoric, but through performance. This is why their story matters, why it deserves to be remembered and told, not just because they were an effective tank battalion, though they were, not just because they earned commendations and citations, though they did, but because they represented something larger than themselves. They were proof that the restrictions placed on black Americans were not based on capability, but on prejudice, not on measured reality, but on irrational bias. The men of the 761st Tank Battalion did not set out to change history. They set out to do their jobs, to support their fellow soldiers, to serve their country, despite the ways that country had failed to fully recognize them. In doing so, they became part of the force that made change inevitable. Their excellence made the old justifications untenable. Their courage made the old assumptions indefensible. Their service made the old system unsustainable. The battalions that followed them, integrated units where race became irrelevant to assignment and opportunity, owed their existence in part to what the 761st proved. Every black officer who commanded integrated units, every black soldier who served without the burden of segregation, stood on foundations that the 761st helped build. The progress was neither automatic nor complete, but it was real, and it came in part because men like Henderson and Williams and Madison and Rivers and Jackson and Wright and Johnson and Hayes and Cooper refused to accept that they were incapable of what they proved themselves capable of achieving. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.